my name is Reverend Alice Reid, and I'm really happy to welcome you here. If I just tap into my alter ego of, I have a little Rain Man in me, and I like to count, and if I counted the Sundays correctly, it's been 30 Sundays since we've been here in the sanctuary. So welcome home and welcome back. I'm so happy to see all your beautiful faces, and I know that the sanctuary is a little different than what you're used to. For those of you at home, we have the seats spaced apart, and everybody's wearing masks, but I can see the smiles in your eyes, and so I'm really glad to be able to look at each one of you and to see you here with us today. This month in October, we are looking at this topic of cosmic connections. And while the topic title might feel a little light and fluffy, given what's going on in the planet right now and going on in our country, there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of people who are feeling very unsettled. Yet this idea of cosmic connections is really this idea about how we are inextricably, how we're really connected. Indeed, while there may be many differences that we see around us as we talk to other people, as we look at other people, at the heart of it, we are all really deeply connected. And what I know is that even though our opinions are very different, all we're trying to do is validate our stories, right? We all have a story. We all have the stories that and this is a story we've been winding our whole life. And the story starts when we begin to grow up and our family begins to tell us a story about the world, and then as we begin to have friends and move out into the world, the story grows, and as we have begin to get in touch with other people other than our inner circles, that story evolves some more. And so as we are moving through this time in our country and in our world of pandemic and uprising and divisive politics, as we're moving through this time, each one of us has come to it with our own unique point of view. And that point of view has been cultivated over many years. And so I want to look at how, even though we have different points of view, we all have a similar way of seeing those points of view. We all have a similar way of gathering information, of beginning to cultivate and nurture our own worldview. What I'm really saying is that we're really wired to validate our own stories. And another way of saying that in a word is that we all have biases. And having a bias simply means that you're in favor of something, that there's something that you lean towards, there's something that you really believe in, or there's something that you don't like, or there's something you feel passionate about. We all have bias. And you may be thinking right now, oh, not me. I don't have any bias. I mean, we came up, right, with news anchors who seemed to have no bias, and people who tried to come to some middle ground story that we could all connect to. And yet, if, in this day and age with social media the way it is, and everybody sharing their opinion freely from everything from what you had for breakfast to how you feel about racism and everything in between, we're getting more and more saturated by opinions and bias, and it's harder for us to really be able to move beyond our own bias. And as a matter of fact, what happens is that our bias begins to really inform us. And what I've been learning about bias recently is that while maybe on the surface, explicit bias seems to separate us, we actually, on a very subtle and unconscious level, use bias to try to connect. Because if we can connect to a group of people who are feeling the same way or thinking the same way we are, well, that's bias too. I recently came across a podcast that really opened my eyes to bias and that unconscious bias that we tend to drop into. Richard Rohr of the Center for Contemplation and Action came together with a couple of other clergy, and one in particular, Paul McLaren, who has identified 13 biases that he feels we all engage in. We all have this idea that we, or these subtle ideas and unconscious things that we lean towards. And on the surface, we may end up in different places, but we all travel the same paths. And so I want to share those 13 biases with you. It's a long list, and Paul has he got very clever, and he alliterated them, all starting with the letter C. So it'd be a little easier for you to digest. And don't try to write this all down. There'll be an opportunity to, I'll share this with you in another way. But the first bias that he comes up with is confirmation bias, consciousness bias, competency bias, confidence bias, community bias, conservative liberal bias, contact bias, complex bias, complementary bias, conspiracy bias, comfort bias. Oh, and I like this one. He calls it catastrophe bias and cash bias. Well, it's quite a list, isn't it? What the heck does he mean by that? We don't have time to go into all of them, but I thought I'd drill down into a couple and share them with you. There are two that he really felt were the big ones that we all tend to engage in. The first one is confirmation bias, and that's where we're looking at our brain chemistry and we're looking at the propensity of our mind to move along certain neural pathways, and to move along those pathways that we've created with our stories. And so confirmation bias is where our brains easily accept what we already know and resist any ideas that disrupt our knowing. He talks about complexity bias, which is a bias that we have where our brains prefer to move into the place of what I would call the path of least resistance, or what Paul would say, that our minds prefer a simple lie to a complex truth. He talks about consciousness bias, and consciousness bias is really that place where we get to where we can't really raise above the level of our understanding. Like our consciousness bias is what we know, and then when there are things that we don't understand, we tend to reject them, and we tend to come back to those places of understanding because that's where our comfort level is. Or as I would like to say, water rises to its own level. Another big one is confidence bias. And when we think about how our brains have evolved over the centuries and the millennia, we've evolved to find safety and protection and to feel safe and protected. And so the confidence bias is where we are wired to seek safety, and our brains prefer a confident lie to a hesitant truth, a confident lie to a hesitant truth. Comfort bias. When we look at this comfort bias, Paul also refers to this as the convenient or complacent bias, and this is where our brains welcome information that allows us to relax and be happy, and rejects data that requires us to change or work hard. I think all of us are familiar with that, and especially, in this time in our culture, in our civilization, in history, where there's so much that could feel uncomfortable, that comfort bias is easy to move into. We all crave relaxation. We all crave that place where we feel connected. This last one that I thought I would dive into is what Paul calls cash bias. And I really thought this was interesting, and it really helped me to see things from a little bit of a different perspective. Paul says that our brains are wired to see within our economic framework. And we see what helps us make money, and it's difficult to see anything that interferes with our livelihood. So I think as I just give you this smattering, I mean, there's pages of really fascinating research behind these 13 bias, but I think as I just kind of give you a smattering of some of these things, you can begin to see that there's some of these ideas are very familiar to you, and these ideas tend to lead us, two completely separate individuals can go in different directions, but using the same bias, and that's where our connection point is. This list really made sense to me as I looked at it, and I began to look at my own bias. And I began to see those places where, especially in my own political biases, how I was using some of these 13, what I would call implicit biases, to really feel connected. To feel connected to people who think like me, to feel connected to people to behave like me, and to reject people that don't think and behave like me. And yet, I think you would agree with me that the thing we all crave right now is a greater sense of unity, a greater sense of wholeness, a greater sense of connection. And as I was looking at these biases, I was thinking about how the biases can, as we lean into them subtly or unconsciously, they can begin to trigger unmet needs. And so I want to get a little nerdy with you right now, and I'm going to ask Stacy to change the slides. Now, you may not be able to read everything, but you might recognize this as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I was looking at the 13 biases, and I was thinking about how each one, when we are struggling, when we're stressful, when we're trying to make greater connection, that if those needs aren't being met, then it would be really easy for us to lean on these biases so that we could feel greater connection. So I attempted to overlay the two, and you can see just, I know it might be a little difficult to read, but you can see, for instance, that a community bias would definitely be something we would lean into, and that community bias is that place where it's hard for us to consider ideas that are different in the group we're in, and that would definitely be fed by the unmet need of belonging and love. And I bring all this forward for you because I would like for you to consider that there are biases, subtle and implicit, that when we can begin to lean in, when we can begin to look at ourselves more closely, when we can raise our self-awareness, well, then we can begin to see where some of the misunderstanding happens, and we can begin to see how somebody who is practicing the same bias that we are is expressing it in a very different way. And then we can begin to see that connection point. And when we can do that self-evaluation and we can begin to have compassion for ourselves, well, then it's easier to have compassion for others. And so I wanted to share a little story with you. If we go back to the main picture, thank you, Stacy. One of my favorite programs, I've been a big fan of Ben Mathis. He started a movement called the Urban Confessional. The Urban Confessional. And the Urban Confessional trains people on how to do deep listening. And they just randomly or selectively set up a table with a sign that says free listening. And the people who are trained to do this listening have learned how to begin to really hold back their own bias, to be able to step aside from the things that are important to them so that they can just be in this place of deep, compassionate listening. And so there was a story that Ben shared 4 years ago during the last election cycle, where Ben had set up a table outside of the Republican National Convention. It was somewhere in the Midwest, maybe Minneapolis, I can't remember exactly. But there was he called it the kind of circus. There was just a lot of activity going on there during the Republican National Convention. And so he had his table set up there, and people would come up throughout the day and they would share things. Some people would share very surfacey things. Some people would try to get a little deeper, but his job was just to do free listening. And at one point during the day, he noticed a woman who was kind of eyeing him up with that sign of free listening. And she seemed to be trying to get her courage up. And so she came over and she's like, "Free listening, huh? Well, listen to this." And she began to talk about how disgusted she was with people who had gotten abortions. She was passionate about how wrong this was. And as Ben was listening, he shared in his story that he had people who he knew who had really struggled with making that kind of choice. And he remembered their pain in making that choice. And in listening to her talk about, how awful people had to be who would get abortions, it was, he could feel his bias and his opinions coming up. But he squelched them, he held back, because he knew he was there to listen. And so I want to read his words about his experience that he had as he was doing some deep listening with this woman. So at some point, he simply says to her, "Thank you for sharing that. Tell me your story. I'd love to know how you came to this point of view." She seemed surprised by his interest. She said, "Why? What does it matter? Your sign said free listening, so I gave you something to listen to." And Ben simply said, "Give me something more to listen to." And so she went on to say, "They should be locked up. It's wrong. It's not right to go out and sleep with whoever, then just vacuum away the results like it never happened." He stood there with her and allowed her to have her experience, and he watched her as she paused and she inhaled as if she was inhaling the whole world. And she went on to say, "It's not fair. All I've ever wanted is to be a mom. My whole life I knew I was meant to have children. Then, when I was 18, the doctor told me I'd never have children. My ovaries were damaged or missing, it doesn't matter which. I kept it a secret, and when my husband found out, he left me. I'm alone, my body doesn't work, I'm old. Who will love me ever?" Sometimes there's nothing to disagree with. And Ben shared he didn't need to be right in that moment. He just needed to be there. He needed to be there to hold her heart so that she could witness herself. She wiped away a few tears and gave Ben a big hug and thanked him for listening. And she exhaled and marched off into the convention where she had come to support her candidates. The thing that the big takeaway for Ben as he was reflecting on that moment with this woman was that he'd hoped that she had felt loved. He'd hoped that she had felt loved. So when we are looking at our bias and we're trying to move into greater understanding, it's important for us to find that sweet spot about taking a stand for things that are important to us, that open our heart, that move us forward, and to recognize that we also need to be in a place of deeper understanding, that all of us are traveling through our bias, and then when we can begin to see our own bias, and we can begin to recognize bias in others, well, then it opens up a place of compassion so that we can listen to one another and have a greater understanding. And so the next time you find yourself completely baffled by somebody's worldview, consider asking them and then listening to the answer. Will you tell me your story? I'd love to know how you came to your point of view. You might begin not only to see your own bias, but to recognize the unmet needs that are underneath them. Thank you very much. I think let's go ahead and let's pray, shall we? This is some big ideas. And thank you. Thank you. And so I would invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze and move your attention into your heart space. For this is the place where we are completely right-sized, where there is no better or worse, where there is no sense of size, where there is no judgment, there's just love. And we know that as we move through this time together, as we continue to travel this journey in this unprecedented time, that we allow our heart to be the guide, that we allow compassion to lead us. And so the invitation today is to stay in our heart, to allow that heart to clear us and to help us to stay focused on what's really important. And that this connection that we crave, this cosmic connection, is always present. We just need to make space for it. And so in this moment, I invite each one of us to say yes. Yes to the sacred now moment. Yes to the heart space. Yes to compassion. And yes to having a greater sense of our connectedness. I know that in this cosmic place of oneness, there is only good. And I claim and demand right now that each one of us connects with that greater good that wants to express by means of each one of us. I give great thanks for this, and it is with a surrendered and joy-filled heart that we simply anchor this in our prayer by saying together, and so it is.